Well, thank you, Steffi, and it's lovely to be here, and it's a real honor to be on stage with Hilary. We're going to start, we don't have too much time, so we're going to be very aggressive in terms of what we're going to try and cover. Hilary, before we start talking about, I'm even nervous about using this word, artificial intelligence. Let's define our terms. I know you're a machine learning person. What word should we be using to talk about the smart technology of the future?
I think it's also, thank you, Steffi. This is very fun. But I think it's a very important question to think deeply about what the language we use means, right? So if we were having this conversation 8 years ago, we would be talking about big data. And now we're talking again about artificial intelligence. So what is that, right? And so today it is the construction of systems that collect data in one place, that allow you to model data, to predict things with data, and then have feedback loops so that they improve with the addition of more data, generally gathered from the world, from people, from sensors, whatever it may be. But if you look at the way people use the phrase AI, it's becoming used in the way that we talk about other people, which is a really interesting shift in our language over the last year.
So we got our terms. How big a deal is this? I mean, there's always the old, I think I may have said this before, the old joke about the Brazilian economy is it's always on the horizon. It's always the next thing, and it never actually happens. I hope there are no Brazilians here. At least that's not true of Germany. We've always heard about AI or machine learning. We've always heard that it's about to transform the world. So far it hasn't, but is it about to, Hilary?
So I'm going to answer this, and then I'm going to ask you a very similar question. And the perspective I bring to this is one of optimism. And so we have this really beautiful vision ahead of us of machines that interact with us using the same tools and interfaces we use to interact with each other. So natural language. We have this idea of machines that can finally mimic parts of creativity, right? This is beautiful, and it's very compelling. But we have to also be realistic about, how these systems work. And so I'll ask you, you wrote a book called The Internet is Not the Answer. And now you have a new book coming out, which I believe addresses this very question, right? So is this the answer? Where do you think we're going to go?
My new book is, thank you for the plug on that. The new book's called How to Fix the Future, and it will be out in January. I agree with you. I think it is a hugely important thing. And without wishing to sound too boring, it can go both ways. I mean, it can theoretically be a dystopia, or at least a nightmare in terms of its impact on employment and our sense of who we are. And at the same time, it can work itself out well. So as we have this discussion about the impact of smart machines on society, on life, what do you think we need to get right? What? I know you're an optimist, but be pessimistic for a moment. What keeps you, I know not much keeps you up at night, but what worries you about this?
This is a good question. So there are many challenges around executing well in this space. And this is true whether we're thinking about it on the level of the impact AI will have on our society, or whether you're just thinking about it in terms of what can I actually do with AI to progress the business I'm building or the product I want to build. And so here are some of the things that worry me. One is that the data that all of these systems are built on is owned by very few companies. And so we have the risk that we have an oligarchy. We have a small set of powerful groups that control the use of the technology. And even when they make the code open source, so if Google has TensorFlow, there are many other open source libraries, they don't make the data open. And so they take the improvements from the community and they own those. So that's one thing that worries me. That's sort of a broad worry. The second thing I'll say very specifically is that we're entering, again, back to language, right? The way we talk about AI today, we don't expect people to understand it. So half of my work is essentially executive therapy talking people through how the thing actually works. So the data comes in, there's some math, a number comes out. Much of what we call AI right now is just supervised classification. So you have some training data, it has labels on it, you have new data, and then you guess what those labels should be. And yet, the way it's being marketed and sold and the way people are starting to think about it sort of abstracts away from the fact that this is just a computer program. It follows simple rules of mathematics and probability. And it's something that everyone here should be expected to understand, at least at a conceptual level, so you know what it's good at, what it's not good at. And when you say smart machines, it also implies that the machines are smart in the way that I'm smarter, you're smarter, everyone here is smart, which is not the case. These machines are fantastic at a certain kind of computation, but it's very different than the way we think.
So I'm going to tell you, so you played the game, you're an optimist, and you explain why you were slightly pessimistic. I'm generally a pessimist, so I'll explain why I'm optimistic. I think the thing with smart machines is that they can, ideally, and this will of course get us to the issue of labor, they can liberate us from incredibly mundane tasks. You're a German audience, you know Marx's vision in the German ideology that the technology of capitalism, or the technology of industrialization would liberate us from most of the mundane tasks of modern life. It didn't, of course, happen in the industrial world. But more and more people believe that if machine learning is applied correctly, it could indeed do this. And of course, this leads to the whole question of the minimum guaranteed income and the socioeconomic kind of infrastructure of this new world.
Can you give some examples of like actually what you imagine that might look like?
Well, there was a piece recently, or actually I think the piece in the paper this morning, critical about how Amazon's takeover of Whole Foods would result in fewer and fewer people working on the cash desk. But I think that's the kind of job that most people don't want. And most of the most menial tasks in the labor market are currently being replaced. So when you go to a modern supermarket, Safeway, for example, in the US, you no longer have people working on the till. Now, for the people who have lost that job and no longer have the opportunity to work, it's obviously a huge problem. But in the long run, those are extremely mundane jobs.
Yeah, so I'd agree. We have a rule that we apply when people want to know if something is a good opportunity for machine learning, and it's essentially this. So first, can a person do it? And then can a group of people do it consistently? And so you look for tasks where you have this kind of ground truth in data, where you can actually expect the same result from any person doing the task. And there are many tasks where this is not the case. So you can think about, anything where you're asking people for a creative impression, it's not consistent. Anything where you ask people to interpret something ambiguous, like humor or sarcasm, it's not consistent. And these are not great tasks for machine learning. But if you have something like working at a cash register, where it doesn't matter, that person in that job is not bringing their individual creativity to the output, then yes, it is a good task for automation.
So I think this is a huge issue, probably the most important, and I'm going to maybe regret saying this, but this may be the biggest issue, not just in technology, but in society in the 21st century. What will distinguish us from smart machines? What can we do that smart machines can't do? And I think what you touched on was our ability to understand ambivalence may reflect the future of the labor market, because we're no longer going to need to do mundane things. But if we're going to have a role in this new world, if we're not going to become subservient, if you like, to these smart machines, we need a new, I know Steffi always talks about the Renaissance. I know that Dr. Berder is a scholar of the Renaissance, and there's been lots of talk about a second or third Renaissance in our digital age. If that Renaissance is going to come, it's going to come through rediscovering who we really are, right?
And are you implying that some of that comes through the choice of whether to engage in mundane tasks?
Sorry, say that again.
So you're talking about how we'll no longer have to do these mundane tasks and we're going to discover our humanity. What does that mean?
You have to read my book. So you ask, what does that mean? Is there a definition of humanity in the 21st century?
Or more, do you imagine that people will still take the job at the cash register, but because they want to, because that's the experience people want to have, versus having to? Like, do you think that choice...
Well, I think that, how many people here would want to work at a cash register? How many people would want to work on an assembly line? How many people would want to spend 12 hours a day doing repetitive, mundane tasks? I think most people would only want to do it if they had to in order to survive. Now, if there is an alternative economic system, the minimum guaranteed income, or some other kind of system which will enable people to support themselves without having to work, I think everyone would choose that, wouldn't they?
Maybe.
And then the other question is, we have this new technology that will, and I'm again rather wary of saying it, but I'll say it, maybe you'll tell me I'm completely wrong, for enabling humanity. We just saw a guy here who was kind of reinventing humanity, the guy before the break, with the use of technology. What's your view on that? I wouldn't necessarily say technology as augmented technology in order to augment humanity, but what is the role of smart technology in reinventing ourselves as a species? Easy question.
Yeah, I'll take a technical point of view and say that the technology has progressed to the point where we can build systems that allow us to access information that was previously inaccessible. So I'll give you a specific example. So at Fast Forward Labs, we do our own research. We also help companies with their problems. In our own research, we've worked extensively on using neural networks to computationally model text, particularly with the goal of automated summarization. And so you can imagine this in one way. I take an article and I put it in the system, and what comes out is a short article that has the same information in the long article. So now instead of reading a long article, I read a short article, and you can say, whatever, I can do either of these things. But then you can say, okay, what if I have 20,000 articles about one topic, and now I have a system that says, oh, there are 10 points of view in these 20,000 articles, and here's that summary of each one. So now I've gone from easing the amount of work it takes me to do the same thing at a slightly lower quality, to giving me an ability to parse information that I as a human being could never access before. I could not possibly read these 20,000 articles in a reasonable amount of time. And so from a technical point of view, what your question is getting at is, what are these, if I can't say augmentation, can I say affordances? What are these superpowers? What are these abilities we gain because we can access a quality and range of information and analysis that was previously out of reach to us as human beings?
And in a world of Twitter and Facebook and all the other inanities, do we need to change ourselves in this new world?
I actually think that perhaps working at a cash register is better for us as humans than working on Twitter for 12 hours a day. So, maybe, maybe we do.
Someone here will, of course, tweet that.
Cool. So my question for you then is, what is the process? I think we have many questions here, and we are just at the part of this conversation where we even define what questions we should discuss, much less have the answers. And so what is the process by which we discover these questions, and what do you think they are?
I think that's right. I think this is the great question of our age, and it's going to become increasingly pertinent in lots of different areas. I think the great question, we were discussing this at breakfast, is what distinguishes us from computers? What can we do that computers can't do? The inventor of software in the 19th century, a Victorian woman called Ada Lovelace, who was the daughter of Lord Byron, suggested that computers could think, but they couldn't originate thinking. They couldn't have goals of their own.
They don't know what they don't know.
They don't know what they don't know. So we do, right? We know what we don't know, and we know what we know, and we have goals, and that's what will determine our relationship with these thinking machines.
I don't think they think.
Can they ever think? Can they be conscious?
How do you define conscious? Because the technology we have today, no, it is not conscious. It is a bunch of data, usually in a text file on a distributed system. It is some mathematical modeling of that data that gives us probabilities and the ability to make predictions, and that's it.
So you don't buy the Nick Bostrom idea of computers having consciousness?
No.
What's the worst case scenario then in this world? If it's not Bostrom's idea of a kind of a new ruling class, a digital ruling class?
So I do love science fiction, and I love the thought experiment and the idea that we can take where we are and push it to an extreme and say, what would happen to our society if this could happen? But I don't think it's highly likely. What I do think is likely is a much less interesting sort of expansion of the digital divide, where some people have access and some companies have access to rich data and the technology to make use of it and to build products that just other people cannot compete with or access. And we see this both in the corporate landscape and also in our personal use of this technology.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think the impact of the network effect on AI could be very dangerous in the sense that just as we have a couple of companies, for example, in the internet industry that are increasingly dominant, I think 95% of all advertising on the internet is monetized either by Google or Facebook. The real danger of AI is one or maximum of two companies dominating this space. That's why I think open AI platforms and new rules and regulations and industry agreements about this are absolutely critical. Because if you have one or two companies dominating this world, then you really do have a kind of a dystopian scenario.
So we have 1 minute left. So if people remember one thing from your remarks today, what would you like it to be?
The Brazilian economy. I think this issue of AI, the open AI, I think that Europeans in particular get this. I think that some of the work coming out of Brussels is absolutely critical in regulating the monopolies of the new digital age. And for reasons which we won't get into, but are fairly self-evident, that regulation isn't coming out of Washington, D.C. So people like Margaret Vestager is absolutely critical in not only guaranteeing against monopolies in the internet industry, but also in AI. What about you on that? What do you get out of this?
So I'm going to say something completely different than what you said, which is that if you remember one thing I said, it's that everyone has the ability and responsibility to actually understand how this stuff works and not to think about it as competition for human intelligence, but rather as robust computational systems that can do really interesting things. So that's it.
And I'm going to ask you one final question, Hilary. We've got 2 seconds left. There's going to be people, especially it's a young audience, a lot of students, a lot of perhaps graduate students here. You're one of the world's leading authorities on machine learning. You have your own agency. What single piece of advice would you give somebody who wants to get into the machine learning industry in one way or the other?
So that's a fun question. And the work that we do is nothing that anyone I worked with learned in school. And this is a terrible thing to say on a university campus, of course. But what you learn is not a body of knowledge that will stay the same over some years, because even 1 year from now, what is possible is very different than what is possible today. So if you want to learn anything, it is how to learn quickly, how to take ideas from one community and apply them in another. And that's really the skill set that we'll need in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and learn math. Thank you.